The cold gets inside the walls before it gets inside you, and by January there is no difference between the two. You're standing in a single room in rural England, sometime in the last years of the 14th century, and the first thing that strikes you is not the darkness, though the darkness is total except for the fire. It is not the smell, though the smell is a physical pressure against the back of your throat, part animal, part rot, part smoke that has nowhere to go and has decided to stay. The first thing that strikes you is the size. You have walked through the door, which hangs low enough that a tall person ducks, and there is almost nowhere left to go. This is the whole of it. This room, these walls, this roof of bundled straw pressing down from above like a lid on a jar. The jar contains a family, their winter animals, on their stored grain, their tools, their dead straw bedding, and the fire that is not a luxury, but the entire reason anyone in this building wakes up before dawn. The hearth is in the middle of the floor, not against a wall, not inside a chimney. In the middle of the floor, like an open wound in the earth, smoking upward into a room it slowly fills. There is a hole in the thatch above it, a rough louvre, and in still winter air the smoke does not so much escape through the louvre as accumulate below it, and then, eventually, reluctantly, sift outward through every gap in the roof. Your eyes are burning before you have been inside for 3 minutes. The infant on the straw mat near the fire coughs in its sleep. It has been coughing for 6 weeks. Nobody says anything about the cough anymore. This is a medieval home. Not a symbol, not a painting, not a reconstruction in a heritage village where a guide in a linen apron explains the loom. This is the real mechanism, operating in real January, with real consequences attached to every decision made inside it, from the moment the fire is relit at dawn to the moment the household collapses sideways onto the sleeping straw. The building is here because the manor allows it to be here. The family is here because the land strips in the open field outside require their labor. The fire is here because if it goes out, the children may not survive until morning. The animals are inside because they generate heat, and because they cannot be left outside in this cold without dying. And dead animals in February are a catastrophe that unfolds across the next 12 months in grain shortfalls and reduced plowing capacity and court fines and debt. Everything in this room is load-bearing. The walls are wattle and daub. Woven hazel sticks, roughly the thickness of a thumb, plastered over with a mixture of clay, animal dung, and chopped straw. Where the daub has cracked, and it always cracks in winter, cold air pushes through with a persistence that is almost aggressive. The cracks are patched when there is time and light and available material. In late January, there is rarely enough of any of those things. The gaps whistle faintly. A strip of old cloth has been pressed into one of the larger ones. A hand-width split near the floor where the daub simply fell away sometime in November. The cloth is dark with moisture. It insulates nothing. It is there because doing nothing felt worse. The timber frame is oak, felled and shaped by whoever built this structure, which was probably someone in the current family's grandparents' generation, though it is difficult to know precisely because the house has been rebuilt in pieces over decades. A beam replaced here, a section of wall patched there, until the original construction has become theoretical. What stands now is a working object, not a designed one. It holds its shape because the posts are seated in the ground, and the weight of the thatch presses down evenly enough that nothing has shifted out of plane. A slight lean toward the east end, where a post rotted and was sistered with a second piece of timber that does not quite match. None is accepted as part of the building's character rather than a structural warning. The floor is earth, compacted over years of use, packed solid in the middle of the room where traffic runs from door to hearth and back, softer and damper near the walls, where foot traffic rarely reaches. A layer of rushes and straw covers the sleeping area. The rushes were fresh in October. They are not fresh now. They are compressed flat and blackened at the edges, and they retain moisture and animal waste and the accumulated debris of 4 months of indoor winter life. They will be cleared and replaced, probably in March, when the weather allows the door to stay open long enough to drag the old material out without losing all the heat the fire has spent 6 hours generating. Until then, you sleep in what accumulates. There is a loft. Not a room, not a floor, a shelf. A rough platform of planks across the upper half of the end wall, accessible by a notched timber leaning against the wall at an angle steep enough that climbing it in darkness requires either practice or patience. The children sleep up there. The planks are gapped enough that sound and air pass through freely, and the loft collects smoke more efficiently than the living space below because smoke rises, and the loft has no exit. The children cough more in the loft than they do near the fire. This is understood, but the alternative is sleeping below with the animals, and the animals move in the night and step on things, and so the children stay in the loft and cough. The windows are 2 openings in the wall covered by wooden shutters. No glass. Glass is for churches and the houses of the wealthy, and places so far removed from this structure that they belong to a different conceptual category. The shutters fit imperfectly. Light comes through the edges when the shutters are closed, which means cold comes through the same edges. When the shutters are opened for ventilation, the room temperature drops within minutes to something that makes fingers clumsy and the nose run. The shutters stay closed for most of the winter day. The room is therefore dark for most of the winter day. A single tallow candle burns near the work area. It smells of rendered animal fat, and it provides approximately enough light to see your own hands. The door is low and heavy and latches with a wooden bar dropped into iron brackets. When it opens, the cold outside rushes in horizontally like something purposeful, killing the warmth the fire has been building since before dawn in approximately the time it takes to bring in an armload of wood. The door is therefore opened as briefly as possible and only for necessary purposes. Bringing in fuel, removing waste, going to the animals, crossing to the outbuildings when there are outbuildings. Every opening is a transaction. You give warmth, you get necessity. You close the door and begin again. The hearth fire is the central fact of the building. Everything else is arranged around it or in relation to it. The iron pot suspended on a chain over the coals contains water and whatever is being cooked. Sink, which in late January is almost certainly a pottage of dried peas or beans, with perhaps a small piece of salt pork if the slaughter season supply has not yet been exhausted. The fire is fed with wood from the wood pile stacked against the outside wall of the building under a rough lean-to of thatch. The wood is green. Seasoned timber is a luxury requiring forward planning and storage space and the absence of immediate desperation, none of which reliably obtain. Green wood burns poorly. It smokes heavily. It requires constant attention. Letting the fire die through inattention is not an option, so it is tended continuously throughout the day and banked at night with the heaviest pieces of wood and covered lightly with ash to hold heat until morning, when it is coaxed back with small kindling and blown into life with breath. And the breath of the household has become part of the building. The family consists of a man, a woman, 3 living children, and, in the corner stall, created by a rough partition of poles, 2 pigs and 4 chickens. There was also an elderly woman through most of the autumn, but she died in November, and her absence has reduced both the labor capacity and the caloric drain of the household in approximately equal measure, which is not a calculation anyone makes aloud, but which operates quietly in the arithmetic of stored grain and remaining weeks of winter. The pigs are not in the house because the family enjoys their company. They are in the house because they weigh approximately 200 pounds combined and they generate a measurable quantity of heat, and because pigs left in an unheated exterior pen in this temperature die. Seeing dead pigs in February are worse than live pigs in the room. The chickens roost on a bar nailed to the partition. They produce eggs intermittently. Their waste falls through the gaps in the rushes onto the earth floor and is addressed when it is addressed. The smell is not something you adjust to. It changes character throughout the day. In the morning, when the fire is being rebuilt and the animals have been static all night, it is thick and ammoniac and earthy. By midday, when the cooking pot has been going for 2 hours and the door has been opened once or twice, it shifts towards something warmer and more complex, wood smoke and animal heat and boiling grain. In the late afternoon, when the light fails and the fire is built higher and the shutters stay absolutely closed, it becomes oppressive, a weight rather than an odor. You stop registering it after enough time, which is not the same as it stopping. Before first light, the man is already on his feet. Not because he has rested well, because he is not, but because there is a specific sequence of tasks that must be completed before the household can function, and most of them require him to begin them. The fire first. Always the fire. He crouches over the banked coals and works the small sticks into the embers, blowing steadily, watching for the catch. When it catches, he builds it carefully, not wastefully, each piece of wood chosen for what it will contribute. This takes between 10 and 20 minutes, depending on how well the banking held overnight. When it has held badly, which happens after very cold nights when the cold pushes through the floor and steals the heat out of the ash, the process is longer and the kindling supply is reduced, and tomorrow morning will be harder. While the fire is being built, the woman nurses the youngest child, which is approximately 8 months old and has been surviving this winter entirely on breast milk because there is nothing else in the house fine enough for an infant to consume safely. She nurses it in the dark by the fire with the competence of someone doing something she has done before and will do again. Not tenderness exactly, but presence, the body performing its function. The child feeds and sleeps and coughs and feeds again. The other 2 children do not wake until they hear the fire established and the pot going. They have learned to wait for auditory cues in the dark. The grain barrel is in the corner away from the fire, which is where stored food is kept to prevent accelerated spoilage from heat. The barrel contains approximately 70 pounds of dried wheat and rye mix, less than it should at this point in the winter based on the projections made during harvest. The harvest was poor. Not catastrophically poor, not the famine-scale failure that visits the memory of older people in the village like a recurring nightmare, but poor enough that the margin built into the summer's hopeful arithmetic has been consumed, and what remains is the core supply with no buffer. Before any of it entered the barrel, it was reduced by the Lord's rent, extracted in kind at the autumn payment due. Before that, it was tithed to the parish church, 10% of everything grown, he assessed at the threshing floor where misrepresentation is not possible because the steward's representative is present. What went into the barrel is what was left after those extractions, and what is in the barrel now is what remains after feeding the household through October, November, December, and 23 days of January. The woman measures the grain with a wooden cup. The cup holds approximately half a pound when level, and she uses it to measure out what will be milled today on the small hand quern kept near the wall. The quern is 2 circular stones, one fixed to the floor and one rotating above it, connected by a wooden spindle. Grinding grain on a quern is slow, hard work that takes approximately an hour of continuous turning to produce enough flour for a day's bread. The alternative is the Lord's mill, and where grinding is done mechanically and efficiently, and where a portion of the grain is taken as payment for the service, and where the obligation to use the Lord's mill rather than a hand quern is, technically, a manorial requirement that is enforced inconsistently, but enforced. The hand quern in this household exists in a gray area of compliance that functions only while no one looks closely. Bread is baked on a flat stone beside the fire, or in a clay pot set into the coals. It is dense and dark, and in lean weeks it is extended with dried peas ground to flour, which changes the texture in ways that are noticeable but not complained about, because complaining about bread assumes the existence of an alternative. There is broth if there is anything left to make broth from. There is pottage most days. to the suspended pot of legumes and grain simmering since morning, thickened with whatever can be added. Meat is salt pork when available, which is less available as January continues. Milk is available only if the household has a cow or goat, and this household does not presently have a cow, the cow having been sold in October to meet a rent shortfall, which is a loss that extends forward in time in multiple directions simultaneously, reducing the caloric reserve, eliminating the possibility of cheese and butter production, and requiring that any ploughing obligations be met with borrowed oxen at rates the household cannot comfortably afford. The cow is gone, and the gap it leaves is not abstract. After the fire and the bread and the grain measure, the man moves to the animals. And the pigs are fed a mixture of kitchen scraps and stored swill kept in a wooden bucket near the partition. They eat quickly and with complete commitment, and they generate significant noise and body heat during feeding. The chickens receive a handful of grain from the diminishing supply, which is a daily calculation against their egg production, which is unreliable in deep winter when light hours are short, and the hens have reduced laying significantly. Right now, the chickens produce perhaps 2 eggs between the 4 of them every 2 days. Each egg is used. Nothing is wasted. Outside, the world is frozen. The path from the house to the small outbuilding used for tool storage and occasional animal overflow is a strip of compacted mud frozen to iron hardness, treacherous in pre-dawn dark because the surface is irregular and slick. And the man crosses it in rough leather shoes that are not waterproof and were not designed with this much winter in mind. His feet are cold before he reaches the outbuilding door. Inside, the tools hang on pegs and lean against the wall. An iron-tipped spade, a wooden-handled billhook, a mattock, 2 sickles wrapped in cloth for winter storage, a short axe for splitting wood. The axe is used every day. It hangs within reach of the door. Beyond the outbuilding, the village spreads in the winter dark, each holding a version of this one, each fire a point of orange light visible through the cracks in shutters and under doors. Each household running through the same morning sequence at roughly the same hour, because the rhythm is the same, because the obligations are the same, because the system that governs all of them runs on synchronized labor demands, and the bell in the church tower at the center of the village is the clock by which that system sets itself. The church bell rings for prime, first prayer of the day. Nobody in this household crosses to the church for prime. Prime is observed privately, or as privately as a single room allows, which is to say that it is observed not at all in any formal sense, but acknowledged in the way that structures of absolute authority are acknowledged by people who have no meaningful alternative to compliance. The church extracts the tithe. The church sets the calendar, and the church determines which days are feast days when certain kinds of labor are prohibited, and which days are fast days when certain foods are prohibited, and which weeks require specific observances that carry implications for how the household organizes its time and food supply. Religion in this household is not primarily spiritual. It is primarily logistical. The tithe was assessed at harvest. Grain, livestock, wool, where applicable, a portion of everything produced. It was taken before the Lord's rent, which means it was taken first of everything, before the household established its own reserve. The parish priest who oversaw the tithe assessment is a man the family sees every week at Sunday Mass and on feast days and at baptisms and marriages and deaths. He is neither malevolent nor particularly sympathetic. So he is an administrator of a system that he did not design and cannot modify, and from which he personally benefits modestly. The interaction between this household and the church is formal and functional, and the spiritual content of it, if any exists, is not visible in the daily mechanics of January survival. The manor is the second layer of the same pressure. The Lord's estate spreads across the landscape outside the village. The domain feels much larger than any single peasant holding, the Lord's granary well stocked, the manor house set at a distance from the village that is both geographic and conceptual. The household on the holding owes labor services to the lord as part of the tenure agreement that governs their right to occupy the house and work the strips in the open field. But the specific services vary by holding and by season: ploughing days on the domain, harvest work, carting duties, occasional maintenance of estate buildings or roads. Winter reduces labor demand but doesn't eliminate it. There are still fences to repair on the domain boundary. There is still timber to be carted from the woodland. There is still the theoretical possibility of being summoned to perform some service on the estate, and if illness prevents compliance, the absence is noted, and the manorial court, which meets periodically in the great hall of the manor house with the Lord Steward presiding, has the authority to impose fines. The fines are not dramatic. That is the important thing to understand. There is no confrontation, no soldiers, no raised voices at the gate. The fine is entered into the court rolls by the steward's clerk in small, neat Latin, and it becomes a debt attached to the tenancy, and it must be paid in coin or produce at the next court session, and if it cannot be paid, then it compounds, and if it compounds sufficiently, then the tenancy becomes unstable, and instability in a tenancy means the household's right to the house, and the strips diminishes, and diminishment leads, through a series of entirely bureaucratic steps, to a different family occupying the structure. The beams do not care who lives under them. By mid-morning the light has improved enough to work without candle. The shutters are partially opened, the cold allowed in as a trade for visibility. The woman works near the fire, spinning if there is wool, mending if there is cloth that has failed, preparing the midday meal, and watching the infant, responding to the demands of the older children who are old enough to be useful, but young enough to require supervision when useful. The oldest child, approximately 9 years old, is sent to gather additional kindling from the woodland edge. Not the Lord's woodland, which is controlled resource with specific rights governing what can be taken and by whom and with what tools, but the common margin near the open field where dead branches and fallen wood can be gathered without legal consequence. The child goes with a small sack. The trip takes 40 minutes. The return load is modest because the accessible dead wood has been heavily gathered throughout the winter by every household, making the same calculation. The man is in the field today, or rather on the path near the field. Not because mid-January is not yet ploughing season and the frozen ground cannot be worked. He is repairing a section of the boundary fence between his strips and the neighbors, a row of hawthorn stakes driven into the ground and woven with horizontal withes. A section has collapsed under heavy snow accumulated on the woven surface. He works with the billhook and with wooden stakes cut from the hawthorn hedge itself, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands reddening, then going partially numb, then accepting their numbness and continuing to function in a diminished way. The work is not complex. It is cold and repetitive, and his body is doing it on bread and pottage and the residue of last night's sleep, which was interrupted twice by the infant and once by one of the pigs shifting noisily in its corner. Nerman which took place on the sleeping straw, in a room where the fire had been banked and the temperature had dropped to something that made staying asleep a continuous effort rather than a passive state. This is maintenance, not progress. Nothing about the fence repair improves the holding's position. It prevents degradation. It is labor exchanged for stasis. He spends approximately 3 hours on the fence, finishes the failed section, and returns to the house. The village he passes through on the way back is not the imagined village of paintings and pageants. It is a collection of structures in varying states of upkeep, each with its own fire smoke rising vertically in the still air, each with its own mud yard trampled to uniformity by foot traffic and animal movement. Each with its specific quiet that is not peaceful. Quiet, but January quiet, the quiet of people indoors, because outdoors is cold, and the work that can be done outdoors in January is limited, and the body conserves energy when it can, because the period between now and the first spring, warmth still contains 6 weeks of caloric obligation. The village well is a communal resource. Water must be carried from it in wooden buckets, which is done once or twice daily. The buckets stored inside near the fire to prevent freezing. The well itself is a hand-dug shaft perhaps 20 feet deep, lined with timber, covered with a wooden lid that is not sealed, and over which things occasionally fall and are occasionally found later. The water is not clean in the modern sense. And it is clean by the standards of a village that does not have a germ theory of disease, and that evaluates water primarily by clarity and absence of obvious contamination. The well is downstream from the animal yards. It has been in this position for generations. Nobody has connected these facts in a way that changes anything. The water is boiled for cooking, not consistently for drinking. Boiling takes fuel, and the connection between boiling and safety is understood imprecisely, if at all, understood more as customary practice with the grain and less as sanitation, methodology. People in this village drink ale more than water for most of the year, small ale brewed by the women of the household with low alcohol content and higher caloric density than water. And the brewing process does involve heating that kills some portion of the bacterial load, which is why ale drinkers survive at rates that water drinkers do not, which is a correlation nobody has articulated, but which shows up in village mortality patterns in ways that the survivors would recognize as meaningful if asked to reflect on it. Nobody is asking them to reflect on it. The oldest child returns with kindling. The sack is perhaps half full, which is better than nothing and not as much as was hoped. The kindling is stacked near the hearth. The fire is built up for the midday meal. The pot is stirred. The family assembles near the warmth in a proximity that is less intimacy than thermal necessity. Midday is the main meal, and it is brief. Bread. Pottage. If there is any salt pork left, it may appear here. And the eating is efficient and quiet. The children eat what is given. The youngest, the infant, is nursed while the others eat. The cat, if there is a cat, and there usually is a cat, because cats catch mice and mice destroy grain stores, circulates near the food preparation area and accepts a small piece of bread rind with professional detachment. After midday, the afternoon. The light is already beginning to angle downward at the time of year when the sun barely rises before beginning its descent, and the window of useful outdoor light is perhaps 6 hours total. Every task competes within that window. The man is at the wood pile, splitting the larger pieces of timber that arrived last week in the fuel store. The axe rises and falls with a rhythm that is partly mechanical, partly meditative, and partly the body finding the most efficient path through a repetitive task. The split wood is stacked under the lean-to. The lean-to is nearly full. This is good. The stack should last through February if consumption rates hold. If consumption rates do not hold, which is to say if the cold intensifies, or if illness increases the fire's demand, or if the wood is greener than estimated and burns faster, then the calculation changes. Inside, the woman is spinning. A drop spindle of clay-weighted shaft and attached thread, wool that was sheared, cleaned, and carded the previous autumn, waiting in a rough bundle for winter evenings when there is nothing else that can be done in reduced light. And the spinning produces thread that will eventually be woven on a small loom or traded for woven cloth or sold at the market if there is anything left after household need. The market is not close. It is a day's walk to the nearest town of any size, which means market access requires a full day of labor time, which is not freely available in winter, which means the product of the spinning may sit unused until spring, when the logistical cost of trading it becomes more absorbable. The thread accumulates in a growing skein. The woman spins and watches the infant and registers the state of the room around her with the peripheral attention of someone who has been maintaining this specific environment for years and whose awareness of its variables is not intellectual but somatic, felt in the body before it is thought. Now she notes that the oldest child has come back with too little kindling without making this a confrontation. She notes that the smoke is heavier than usual today without altering her work. She notes that the infant's cough has not improved in 3 days, and she holds this note somewhere in the back of her attention where it waits, doing nothing useful. The cough. It started 6 weeks ago, which would place its origin in mid-December, when the temperature fell sharply and the household spent a series of consecutive days entirely indoors with the fire burning at maximum capacity and the smoke, therefore, at maximum density. The infant breathes at floor level when not being held, which is where the smoke is least dense because smoke rises. But the smoke does not leave cleanly, and it settles and it accumulates in the lower air after enough hours. An infant cannot request better air. An infant breathes what is available. The cough is productive, which is to say there is something in the chest that the cough is attempting to move, which is considered worse than a dry cough. The woman has given the infant a tea made from dried thyme collected last summer and stored, thyme being understood to have some quality that addresses chest complaints. It may or may not be doing anything. The cough continues regardless. There is no physician within accessible distance. There is an herbalist in the village, an older woman whose knowledge of plant remedies is inherited and practical, and whose success rate is the village's entire medical infrastructure. She has been consulted. She provided the thyme tea and a recommendation to expose the infant to steam from the cooking pot. The steam is being attempted. The infant is held over the pot periodically, wrapped in cloth, breathed over. Whether this helps is not measurable. The woman does it because it is doing something, and doing something is preferable to doing nothing when the alternative to doing something is sitting with the weight of not knowing. The church provides another framework for illness. Prayer is offered. The household has a small wooden cross on the wall near the sleeping area. There are saints whose particular domain includes children's health and respiratory complaints, and intercession is requested through prayer addressed to these saints, with the sincerity of people for whom divine intervention is not metaphorical, but functionally real, who integrated into the causal model by which the world operates. God causes things. God prevents things. Behavior, compliance, prayer, and correct observance influence outcomes. Illness may be punishment or test or neither, but the response to it includes spiritual action alongside whatever material remedies are available. The spiritual actions and the thyme tea are not in conflict. They operate in parallel as two components of a single response to a crisis that cannot be solved by either alone and that might not be solvable by both together. The cough continues. The snow melt began a week ago, a false thaw that brought 2 days of temperatures above freezing before the cold returned and rehardened everything. During those 2 days, the earthen floor absorbed water pushed upward by thawing ground. Then the straw bedding soaked through from below faster than it could drain. When the cold returned, the wet straw did not freeze solid because the interior of the building stays above freezing at night as long as the fire holds. But it did not dry either because there was no airflow sufficient to dry it. It has been wet for a week. The smell of wet and decomposing straw is the room's baseline odor now, layered beneath the smoke and the animal smell. Wet straw is a medium. It supports the rapid development of mold, and it provides habitat for the insect population that overwinters in the bedding, primarily fleas and lice, which are not in this household by accident or by negligence, but are simply present because they are always present in structures of this type with this amount of animal contact and this rate of bedding renewal. The fleas are not catastrophic individually. Each bite is a minor irritation. The cumulative load across a household, across a winter, is fatigue and broken skin and secondary infection, where scratched bites become open wounds that the dirty fingernails of people who have limited water and no soap make worse. None of this kills directly. All of it costs. The body redirects energy toward inflammation and minor infection that it would otherwise apply to labor and warmth retention. The children scratch in their sleep. The youngest child scratches even in the fitful sleep of illness. This is the texture of winter domesticity, stripped of all its retrospective romance. By mid-afternoon, the light is beginning to fail. The man has finished splitting wood and has spent an hour on a second task, reinforcing the post at the corner of the lean-to that has been wobbling since November, packing the base with stones and clay and testing it with weight. The post holds better, but not perfectly. He notes this and does not note it again because perfect is not the standard. Sufficient is the standard. The standard is maintained. The fire is built up. The evening pottage is prepared. The family assembles for the second and final meal of the day. After eating, the evening is short because candle and firelight together cannot sustain complex work, and because the body, which has been running since before dawn on bread and legumes and cold air, is beginning to present its invoice. The children go to the loft. The process of going to the loft involves pulling the leather jerkin tighter, climbing the notched post in diminished light, some in lying down on the planks on a thin layer of straw with a rough woolen blanket and the company of whoever else is up there. The smoke collects around them. They breathe it because it is there, and eventually they sleep. The woman nurses the infant one last time for the day and lays it in the small wooden cradle near the fire. The cradle is worn smooth from use by multiple children. She rocks it once, automatically. The infant settles. The cough is quiet for now. The man banks the fire. Heavy pieces of wood laid on, then covered with ash raked from the edges of the hearth, insulating the coals against the overnight temperature drop. He does this carefully because this fire must survive until dawn, and its survival is not metaphorical. The room will cool significantly overnight, even with the banked coals. And the animals in the corner contribute their body heat. The straw bedding contributes its insulation. The walls, cracked and patched and whistling slightly in the wind that has begun to pick up from the north, contribute what they can. He lies down on the sleeping straw next to his wife. They are not comfortable. Comfort is not the operative category. They are approximately warm enough to sleep and approximately fed enough to wake tomorrow, and that is the margin within which this household operates and has always operated and will continue to operate until it no longer can, at which point a different household will operate within the same margin in the same building. The fire holds through the night. This is success. 3 weeks pass inside the same walls. The specifics vary. The sequence does not. Fire at dawn, grain measured, bread made, animals fed, tasks allocated across the daylight hours, evening meal, sleep, fire at dawn. In those 3 weeks, the grain barrel is reduced by approximately 9 pounds. There are approximately 11 weeks until the first viable harvest of spring greens. The barrel contains approximately 61 pounds of remaining grain. The household requires approximately 4 pounds per day across all uses, including animal supplementary feeding. 61 pounds divided by the daily rate produces a number that is less than the weeks remaining. This is not yet an emergency. It is the approach of one. The approach of scarcity changes the texture of the room before it changes the actual content of the barrel. The measure becomes more careful. The cup is leveled more precisely. The pottage is thinner than it was in November. The oldest child is given a slightly smaller portion without the reduction being explicitly announced, which is something children notice but do not have a framework for addressing, and so they do not address it. The cat receives less bread rind. The pigs are given less swill. The chickens are given less grain. Across the household, every living thing is being slightly rationed against a shortfall that may or may not materialize depending on factors that include weather, the timing of spring, the survival of the seed grain, and the absence of any further crisis. The infant's cough has deepened. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Gradually, the way all crises in this household arrive. Through accumulation rather than event. The productive cough has become a wet cough. The chest, when the woman lays her ear against it, sounds occupied. Now there is a fever, detectable by touch, not extreme but persistent, present in the morning and still present in the evening, and present again the following morning. The infant nurses less efficiently. It is using energy to be ill that it needs for growth. The woman does not express panic because panic is a luxury and because there is nothing visible that could be done differently. She has the time tea. She has the steam. She has the prayer and the intercession of saints and the wooden cross on the wall and the proximity of the fire. She has her body and her presence and the continued mechanical fact of nursing. She applies all of these. The fever does not respond to any of them. The fever does not worsen, which is noted as a form of neutral good news, but it does not break. On the 8th day of the fever, the man goes to the village priest, not because the priest has medical knowledge, but because the priest has a relationship with the framework within which health and illness are understood, and because there are final rites to be considered, and because considering them in advance is practical rather than pessimistic. The priest is a young man who came to this parish 4 years ago, from a monastery where he received a basic education in Latin and liturgy, and who has been learning the pastoral dimensions of his role through direct and recurring exposure to illness, death, birth, and conflict. He visits the household and prays over the infant. He brings a small quantity of holy water. He does not pretend to know what will happen. The infant survives. This needs to be recorded directly because the outcome was genuinely uncertain and the fact of survival is not a comfort automatically. The infant survives the fever, which breaks on the 10th day in a night of heavy sweating that soaks the cradle straw and requires it to be replaced in the cold before dawn of the 11th day. The cough remains. It will remain in some form through February and into March, gradually reducing in frequency as the air improves with the approach of warmer weather. The infant survives. The household absorbs this outcome and continues, but the 10 days of the fever's peak are 10 days during which the woman's labor is partially redirected from household production to infant monitoring. The bread is made, but not well. The spinning does not happen. And the oldest child takes on tasks that are slightly beyond its capacity and executes them slightly below the required standard. The fence repair the man was going to complete on the south end of his strips is postponed. The postponement is a small decision with a forward reach. The fence in its damaged state is a liability for spring when the animals are turned out, and boundaries become active rather than theoretical. 1 week after the fever breaks, a message arrives from the manor steward. The message is delivered orally by one of the Lord's bondsmen who comes to the door and states the information without entering and without waiting for a response. The household has been reported as absent from a recent estate road maintenance obligation, a compulsory Labor Day called several weeks earlier, during which this holding failed to produce a worker. The absence has been noted. The matter will be heard at the next session of the manorial court. The next session is in 3 weeks. The man stands at his door in the cold and watches the bondsman walk back up the village track without speaking because there is nothing useful to say. The absence was real. They were absent because the infant was at the worst of its fever, and leaving the household unattended for a full Labor Day was not something the woman could support and was not something he was willing to do. These facts are true, and they are irrelevant to the court. The court does not assess cause. It assesses absence. He goes inside and does not immediately tell the woman, not because he is concealing the information, but because he needs to know what he knows before he can manage what the telling will do to the room. The room is already thin. The telling makes it thinner. She receives the information without visible response, which is not absence of feeling, but its compression, a small interior collapse that has nowhere to go and so goes nowhere visible. The court will impose a fine. They are not certain of the amount, but they know the range. Previous fines in the village for labor default have run from a few pence to a shilling, depending on the nature of the duty missed, and the steward's mood and the record of the household in question. This household's record is adequate, but not exceptional. The assessment is made by a man who does not know the infant was sick because the system is not designed to know those things, only to register presence and absence and to price the difference. They have approximately 4 shillings worth of portable value in the household at this moment. The value exists in a small quantity of silver coin kept in a cloth bag wedged between a beam and the thatch, in the 2 remaining pigs now that one was sold in December, and in a small reserve of wool from last autumn's shearing. A fine of 6pence takes 1/8 of what they have. A shilling takes a quarter. Both amounts are material. The weeks between notification and court are standard operational weeks in which everything continues as before, with the addition of the fine's approaching weight, making every grain measure slightly more fraught. The man considers approaches. He could appeal to the Lord directly, but the Lord is not involved in the daily administration of the manor, and direct appeals to him are not normal procedure and would require a reason significant enough to justify the departure from procedure. An infant's illness is not likely to qualify. He could argue at court, present the illness as mitigation. The steward may accept this. The steward may not. Courts of this kind have no formal mercy provision. They have the steward's discretion and the steward's opinion of this household and the precedent of similar cases, none of which the man has reliable information about. He prepares no formal defense. There is no formal defense to prepare. He prepares instead to attend the court, acknowledge the absence, and pay whatever is assessed, which is the only strategy available to someone in his position. The court session is held in the great hall of the manor house, a building so much larger and sturdier than the household's own structure that the 2 objects barely belong to the same conceptual category. Timber-framed, but with plastered interior walls and glass windows, and a fireplace in the actual wall, with an actual chimney channeling smoke out of the building rather than into it. The floor is stone. The hall is cold, but not smoke-filled, and this is the most immediate physical difference from the household's own interior. Here the fire works for the room rather than against it. The steward sits at a table. His clerk sits beside him with the court rolls. There are perhaps a dozen other tenants present, each with their own matter before the court, and each waiting in the cold hall for their turn to be addressed. The proceedings are conducted in English with Latin used for the formal record. Each case is called, stated, heard briefly, and adjudged. The man's case takes perhaps 4 minutes. The absence is confirmed. The reason is not asked for. The fine is set at 8pence. The clerk writes. The steward moves to the next case, 8pence. Payable at the next court session. The man leaves the hall into the winter air and begins the walk home. 8pence is more than nothing and less than catastrophic. It is approximately the value of 2 chickens or 1 large bundle of firewood bought rather than gathered, or several days of hired agricultural labor. To meet it, the household will sell one of the chickens and surrender a small quantity of wool from the stored reserve. This reduces the egg production capacity and the spring weaving reserve simultaneously. Both reductions are absorbed. Neither is comfortable. The household absorbs this and continues. February arrives in the way that February always arrives in this part of England, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of being the month in which winter shows its final and most extended face. The novelty of cold has long since passed. The cold is simply the condition now, the background radiation of daily existence. The stored reserves are the lowest they will be before spring eases the pressure. The body's caloric deficit is its widest. Every physical task costs more than it would in summer because the body is also paying, continuously, for the heat it loses to the ambient temperature of the building. And the man's hands are the record of the winter. The knuckles are cracked and bleeding slightly at 3 separate joints, the skin split by cold and repeated wetting and drying from water-handling tasks. He packs the cracks with tallow, the same rendered fat that makes the candles, pressing it into the splits and rubbing it in with the inside of his thumb. It seals the worst of them temporarily. The cracks reopen within hours. He repacks them. This is a daily ritual of winter maintenance, applied to the body the same way he applies daub to cracks in the wall. The woman's hands are worse. Not from cold exposure, she works mostly inside, but from the quern. 2 to 3 hours of quern work every day transfers directly into the lower palm and the base of the thumb joints, building callus over months. And then, when the callus reaches its limit, unsplitting. She grinds with her hands wrapped in cloth strips when the splits are open. She grinds without the cloth when it impedes grip. The flour still needs making. In the second week of February, the thatch develops a visible sag over the eastern end of the structure. The sag is caused by a combination of accumulated moisture in the thatch bundles from repeated freeze-thaw cycles and the weakness of the secondary rafters at that end. The same rafters that were identified as marginal in autumn and not replaced because replacement required obtaining suitable timber from the woodland, which required a license or a negotiated right from the Lord's wood ward, which required time and social capital and a specific absence of other demands on both. The man climbs onto the roof with a rope of twisted straw and a bundle of thatch material from the spare supply kept in the outbuilding for exactly this contingency. He ties off to the ridge beam and works along the sagging section, pressing new material into the gap and securing it with the twisted straw ties. The work is done in a wind from the northeast that has started during the night and which at roof height is considerably more present than at ground level. The cold at roof height with the wind factored in is a different category of cold from the cold inside the house, or the cold at fence repair height. It reaches into the coat and under the cloth wrapping on the hands and takes direct possession of the ears and nose and the back of the neck. He works as quickly as competence allows. The rethatch is adequate, but he does not know how adequate because the only way to test thatched roof work is to wait for rain or snow and observe whether water enters the structure at the repaired location. If it does not, the work was sufficient. If it does, he climbs back up. This is the medieval quality control system for roofing, and it is not ineffective, only iterative and slow, and conducted at altitude in bad weather. He descends from the roof into the house, and his hands have lost significant dexterity from the cold. He holds them near the fire for 20 minutes before they return to full function. The woman has noted the sag and the repair without asking about it because the question would not add information she needs, and the answer would not change anything that can be changed. And when the third week of February, the neighbor's pig escapes through a gap in the boundary fence and roots through the corner of the household's kitchen garden, which is the small enclosed area near the house where cabbages and leeks and a few other vegetables are grown for household use. The garden is dormant in winter, nothing growing above ground, but the root systems of the leeks are in the soil, and the pig's rooting has disturbed approximately a third of the leek bed. Some roots will recover, some will not. In summer, this damage will translate directly to a reduction in the household's leek supply. Leeks are not a luxury. They are a substantial component of the pottage that carries the household through the late summer and autumn. The neighbor is informed. The conversation is conducted at the boundary fence with both parties standing on their own side, which is the correct geometry for a boundary dispute of this kind. The neighbor acknowledges the damage, expresses regret in the formulaic way that boundary disputes generate, and offers to make some form of amends, the details of which are discussed and partially agreed upon. The amends will be a bundle of dried legumes from the neighbor's store, which is slightly more than nothing and slightly less than compensation. There is no violence. There is no shouting. There is a careful negotiation conducted by two households who know that they will be neighbors for the rest of their lives, and whose children will be neighbors after that, and whose land strips interleave in the open field, such that cooperation is structurally mandatory. And the pig returns to the neighbor's holding. The leek bed is left to recover as much as it can. The dried legumes arrive 3 days later in a small cloth bundle left at the door. The household absorbs this and continues. What the household cannot absorb is what it does not yet know. Spring will come, and with it, the plowing. The man's household is entitled to use of the communal oxen for their plowing days, 2 days of plowing allocated to each holding based on the strip arrangement in the open field. The oxen are the village's shared capital, and their condition at ploughing time depends on how well they have been wintered, which depends on how much fodder was stored the previous autumn, which was a poor harvest autumn. The oxen are thin, not dying thin, not the catastrophic thinness of animals that will not survive to spring. Thanks, but the working thinness of animals that have been maintained at minimum rather than optimal levels through a difficult winter. Thin oxen plow slowly and tire faster than well-conditioned oxen. This means that the 2 allocated plowing days will cover less ground than they would if the oxen were stronger. Less ground covered in 2 days means fewer strips turned before the second plowing window closes. Strips not plowed in the first window wait for the second, which comes later and gives the grain less growing time before harvest. Less growing time is less yield. The man does not know the specific condition of the oxen yet. He will know at plowing time. At plowing time, there will be nothing to do with the knowledge except work within the constraint it creates, which is the form that most of the knowledge he acquires about his situation takes. Information delivered too late to alter the upstream decisions that created the situation, actionable only in the downstream adjustment of behavior within a narrowed possibility space. He knows what the grain barrel contains. He knows what the quart fine cost. He knows the infant survived the fever. He knows the thatch has been repaired. He knows the leak bed is damaged. He knows the fence needs more attention. These are the known variables of late February in a specific household, in a specific year, and they do not tell a simple story of survival or failure because they have not yet produced either. What they produce is the late February room, which is this: smoke and lamp black on the rafters above, and the ring of soot on the ceiling boards of the loft darkened to black by 4 months of hearth operation, visible in the morning light when the shutter is cracked. Earth floor dried slightly in the area immediately around the hearth, still damp near the walls. The straw bedding due for replacement. The grain barrel at its minimum, the wood pile at its minimum, the patience of the household at its minimum in the way that patience at the end of a long winter is not a moral quality, but a physical one. A stored reserve depleted the same way grain is depleted. The oldest child has been helping since November. Not as a child helping, but as a small laborer with assigned tasks and understood consequences for incomplete work. The child is 9. 9-year-old children in this household are workers before they are anything else that a later century might describe them as, not because their parents are cruel, but because the household requires labor, and labor must come from somewhere, and the bodies available to provide it include the 9-year-old. The child fetches water and gathers kindling and tends the animals in the interior during cold evenings, and runs errands to neighboring holdings and assists with food preparation and, in the season when it applies, works in the field on tasks scaled to available strength. The child does this without school, without leisure time in any formal sense, without a bedroom or privacy or a defined childhood space. The child lives where the family lives and works where the family works and eats what the family eats at the rate the family eats it. In a good year, this is less brutal than it sounds. In a winter like this one, it is exactly as brutal as it sounds. The middle child is 6 and contributes less directly, but is also subject to the household's temperature and air quality and food rationing and illness exposure. The 6-year-old has not been notably sick this winter, a fact the parents note privately with the specific gratitude of people who know that the absence of illness is not a default state, but an outcome that could have gone differently. The infant, now recovered from the fever, is growing. Slowly. The breast milk that is its entire diet is the product of the woman's caloric intake, which is itself the product of a diminishing grain barrel. Breast milk quality and quantity in a malnourished woman decreases. The infant's growth rate will slow, almost imperceptibly, over the next weeks. It will reach spring slightly smaller than it would have reached it if the winter had been easier. This is not visible. It is measurable only across years in the accumulated weight of multiple reduced winters in the body of a child growing into an adult who will be slightly shorter than maximum genetic potential, slightly more susceptible to certain health vulnerabilities, carrying the winter of 1390-something in the density of the bones. The body is the record. The church bell rings. Sext, midday prayer, and the sound carries across the village to the holding where the fire is burning, and the pottage is simmering, and the woman is nursing, and the man is at the outbuilding sorting through the seed grain that has been set aside in a separate, smaller container from the food grain. Seed grain. So the one reserve that cannot be touched regardless of hunger. Touch the seed grain and there is no spring planting. No spring planting and there is no harvest. No harvest, and the winter that follows is incomparably worse than the winter currently being survived. The seed grain is therefore a hard boundary that the household does not approach, not even in the worst weeks, and the visual presence of the separate container with its specific reserve is both a constraint and a reminder. The future is in this box, and the box must not be opened until April. He checks the seed grain every few weeks, looking for signs of moisture damage or rodent incursion. The cat is the primary defense against rodent incursion, and the cat, a gray-brown animal with a notched ear from a long-ago territorial dispute, has demonstrated its utility throughout the winter by depositing small rodent remains near the outbuilding door with the regularity of a report. The seed grain appears intact. This is a small but significant piece of good news in a month short on such things. He returns to the house. Midday meal, bread and pottage, thinner than before, but still both present. The family eats with the efficiency that comes from doing something enough, times that the social ritual has reduced to its functional minimum. Food is eaten because the body requires it, in the amounts available, at the time available. The afternoon is wool sorting, the man sitting near the fire working through the remaining wool reserve and separating the longer fibers suitable for spinning from the shorter material that will be used as stuffing or sold at significantly lower value. Now, this is not his usual work, but the woman's hands are particularly bad today. The split at the base of her right thumb having reopened during the morning grinding, and spinning in this condition is impractical. He does what can be done with the wool without the fine motor work of the spindle. This is the household's economy of labor. Tasks move between hands based on capacity, not specialization. By late afternoon, the wind has increased. The building responds to wind in the way that buildings of this type always respond, which is to say, imperfectly. The gaps that whistle when there is no wind now whistle louder. The cloth strip packed into the large crack near the floor has worked loose, and cold air enters through the gap in a small but detectable stream. The man restuffs the gap. The stuffing works as long as the wind does not increase further. The wind increases. The fire is built higher than usual in the evening, using the supply faster than the daily average, because the wind means the temperature inside the building is lower than it would be on a still night, and the fire must compensate. Using the supply faster means the projection about the woodpile lasting through February becomes slightly less reliable. Small adjustments. The woodpile is checked. There are approximately 18 days of supply at current usage. There are approximately 14 days until the cold should begin to moderate. The margin is 4 days, which is adequate unless the cold extends, which it sometimes does. The night is loud with wind. The thatched roof responds to wind with a low, continuous conversation of straw and binding ties, shifting against each other, not alarming, not structural, but audible, the building speaking to itself about the forces being applied to it. The ridge beam holds. The lateral timbers hold. The rethatched section over the eastern end holds, which is either a tribute to the quality of the repair or the specific direction of tonight's wind, which is from the northeast and loads the western slope more heavily than the eastern. In either case, it holds. The children sleep in the loft in the wind noise. The woman sleeps next to the banked fire with the infant's cradle within arm's reach. The man sleeps for 5 hours, wakes before dawn, tends the fire, and begins again. The beginning of March announces itself not dramatically, but through a slight shift in the quality of the cold. The cold is still absolute, but it is no longer advancing. It has reached its limit. Whatever that limit is in this year, it has been met, and the direction of change is, tentatively, reversible. The ground is still frozen. The air still bites. But the light is longer by an unmistakable 10 minutes at each end of the day, and the 10 minutes is itself a resource, a small gift of usable time at each boundary of the working day. The household does not celebrate this. The change is noted instrumentally. Longer light means more work possible. More work means better preparation for spring. The household turns its attention in the direction of what must be done before ploughing time rather than what must be endured until ploughing time. The straw bedding is cleared. This is the first significant improvement to the room's material condition since November. The old bedding, compressed and blackened and host to its accumulated insect population, is dragged out through the door in armloads and dumped in the midden, the household's waste pile located at a specific distance from the house in the direction least likely to affect the kitchen garden or the water path to the well. The dragging takes most of a morning. The room, once stripped of its bedding, looks and smells dramatically different. The earthen floor is exposed in its actual condition, which is damp and somewhat churned, but fundamentally the same floor it has been since before the oldest child was born. Fresh rushes from the supply stored in the outbuilding are spread across the sleeping area. And they are not fragrant exactly, but they are dry, and they are new, and the room smells of cut vegetation instead of 6 months of occupied straw for the first time since October. The children respond to fresh bedding the way they respond to any material improvement. Immediately, physically, without analysis. The oldest rolls on the new rushes. The 6-year-old sleeps 2 hours longer than usual on the first night on fresh material and wakes without the habitual scratching that was the morning signature of the winter bedding. The walls are checked for winter damage. 3 sections of daub have fallen away to a degree that requires patching rather than stuffing. The man mixes new daub from the supply of clay near the base of the field boundary, combining it with straw and a small amount of animal dung from the winter accumulation in the animal corner, which he has cleared out over the preceding days into the midden. He applies the new daub to the failed sections with his hands, working it into the gaps and smoothing it against the existing surface. The daub must dry slowly, which means no large fire directly facing the patched areas for several days, which is a constraint but manageable now that the ambient temperature is rising. The structure is assessed for winter damage with the practical knowledge of someone who built nothing but has maintained this building for 12 years and knows every beam and joint in it with the familiarity of a body, knowing its own skeleton. The post at the corner of the lean-to is still marginal, and the thatch over the eastern end is the best it has been since the previous summer. The ridge beam has not moved. The notched timber stairway to the loft has developed a crack in the 5th notch that will need a replacement section before much more use. He notes this the way he notes everything that needs attention, without urgency, with accuracy, with the knowledge that the queue of necessary work is long and the available time is finite, and the sequence of priority is determined by proximity to structural failure. The ploughing must come before the post must come before the stairway must come before the shutter rehang on the north-facing opening. Everything in sequence, everything within the available labor, everything balanced against the ongoing demands of feeding and maintaining and fulfilling the obligations that do not pause for repairs. In the middle of March, the manorial court meets again, and the fine is paid. The man attends the court, waits his turn, produces the coin and the small quantity of wool that together constitute the 8 pence assessment, and receives acknowledgment that the debt is cleared. The clerk crosses the entry in the court roll with a single line. The matter is concluded. The record remains, a single crossed entry in the manor's administrative documentation. one line among dozens covering the same session, the administrative crystallization of a winter that included a sick infant and a missed Labor Day, and a family's calculations about what they could and could not afford to prioritize. He walks home through mud that has started to develop the specific character of March mud, which is different from November mud in that it is beginning to dry from the surface rather than being continuously refreshed by precipitation, which means the path is less uniformly wet and more treacherous in patches, islands of relative stability around ice melt pools that require navigation. He knows this path. He does not fall. The manorial court's decision does not change what happened inside the house during the winter. It changes only the household's administrative status within the estate, from indebted to Claire, which matters for future interactions with the system, but which does not retroactively warm the cold room or feed back the grain that was measured in handfuls, or repair the time lost to fever management, or restore the leek roots the neighbor's pig destroyed. The winter's costs are the winter's costs. They are paid in the grain barrel's lower level. They are paid in the seed reserve held intact at its expected volume, which is not a given, but an outcome of specific choices made under specific pressure. They are paid in the infant's chest, which continues to produce a residual cough that is clearly less severe than February's worst, but which has not fully resolved, and which the woman tracks with her peripheral attention, the way she tracks all the variables of the household. They are paid in the man's hands, which are cracked and healing. The worst of the winter splits closing with the improving weather and the lessened water exposure. They are paid in the woman's hands, similarly. They are paid in the children's bodies, which emerged from winter slightly diminished in ways not visible to casual observation, but measurable in growth rates and immune resilience over years. The field is the next object of attention. The man walks his strips in the early March light, assessing the soil. It is still too wet to plow. The frost has left the ground entirely in the upper few inches, but the subsoil is saturated from snow melt, and the surface has a sheen of wet that tells him clearly, through the feel of the soil under his boot, that the oxen would bog in this if driven across it now. He notes the condition and waits, saying this is one of the disciplines of agricultural life that operates on the body as much as on the mind. The ability to be ready to act and to wait in readiness without the waiting becoming distraction. The window will open. He will not miss it. He is watching for it the way the household watches the fire in the night, peripheral and continuous. The village around him is doing the same, watching. Every holding in the open field arrangement is dependent on the same soil, drying at the same rate, and the same oxen turning available at scheduled plowing days in the same sequence. The communal coordination of medieval agricultural life is not a romantic collective but a mechanical necessity. Multiple households operating in synchrony, because the shared infrastructure of oxen and field arrangement makes independent timing impossible. Don't you plow when the rotation allows and the soil permits and the oxen are available. These three conditions must coincide. When they do, everyone plows. The strips in the open field run in parallel ridges across the slope, each strip approximately a furlong in length and a chain in width, the ridged and furrowed surface the result of generations of plowing in the same direction, building the crown in the center of each strip slightly higher than the edges, so that water drains to the furrows between strips rather than pooling on the growing surface. This is not designed drainage. It is the accidental consequence of always turning the plow furrow toward the center of the strip, but the accident functions, and the strips drain adequately in wet springs because generations of plowing have given them this specific topography. The man's holding includes several strips in different parts of the field, distributed according to the allocation system that spreads each holder's land across good and poor soil zones rather than concentrating it. An arrangement that distributes both advantage and disadvantage, and that makes large-scale consolidation of holding into efficient farm units logistically complex. This is not accidental. The distribution prevents any single tenant from accumulating disproportionate advantage within the village's agricultural system, which is a feature rather than a bug from the perspective of the manor's need for predictable distributed labor across the whole field. He knows each of his strips. He knows which one drains early and which one holds moisture late and which one has a tendency toward dockweed that must be controlled, or it will reduce the wheat yield in that strip significantly. He knows these strips the way the house knows his body, through long contact, continuously updated. The strips are his, conditionally. They belong to the manor legally. He holds them by right of tenure, a right inherited from his father who inherited it from his father. A right that is recorded in the manor's records and that defines his household's right to exist in this village, work this land, occupy this house, and participate in this system. The tenure is stable as long as he complies with its conditions. The conditions include the labor services, the rent payments, the suit of court, and the various smaller obligations that the manorial custom specifies. He has been complying for 12 years. The winter was a test of compliance under pressure, and he has, barely, passed it. The knowledge of how close to failing is private, and he does not dwell on it because dwelling on it does not help, and the spring will require his full attention, and the full attention is what he has to give. Toward the end of March, the soil dries. Not uniformly, not completely, but sufficiently. The oxen are assessed by the village's informal agricultural authority, which is a combination of the plough supervisor hired by the manor and the oldest farmer whose opinion carries weight based on demonstrated judgment over decades. The oxen are thin but functional. The decision is made to begin. Ploughing days are assigned in the rotation. The man's first ploughing day comes in the sequence. He rises before dawn, and the preparation for ploughing begins with a specific and detailed set of tasks. The plough assembled from its winter storage components, the iron ploughshare cleaned of rust with sand, the wooden beam and handles checked for winter damage and found adequate, the trace harness for the oxen retrieved and inspected. The oxen themselves are collected from the village's shared animal enclosure, yoked together by the plough supervisor's assistant, and led to the first strip. The work of ploughing is the work of turning the earth's surface to a depth sufficient for planting, breaking the compacted surface, and mixing it with the organic material that has accumulated on top, creating the seed bed. The plough cuts and turns. The oxen pull. The man guides the handles. This sounds simple. No, it is not. The plough must run at consistent depth, neither skimming the surface nor digging so deep that the oxen exhaust themselves before the furlong's end. The soil of each strip has its own character, and the depth of previous ploughing affects how hard the current ploughing is. The man adjusts the plough angle continuously through feedback from the handles. His hands, cracked and healing, grip the handles with full pressure, and the combination of vibration from the plough and the residual weakness in the healed skin produces something between discomfort and pain that becomes background within an hour. The furlong is walked forward. The plough is lifted at the end. The team is turned. The furlong is walked back. At the end of the day, approximately 1.5 strips have been ploughed. In a better year, with stronger oxen, so as a full 2 strips would be standard. The shortfall is half a strip, which is approximately half an acre, which in wheat terms is perhaps 3 to 5 bushels of yield lost from this year's harvest. 3 to 5 bushels is approximately 2 weeks of household grain supply. He does not calculate this explicitly as he unharnesses the oxen in the evening light. He does not need to. The calculation is in the body, the same way all the winter's calculations were in the body, a running total maintained without paper or deliberate arithmetic, updating continuously as conditions change, shaping decisions in the way that all accurate models of one's situation shape decisions. Silently, from below. The second ploughing day comes 3 days later. The strips ploughed on the first day have begun to dry to workable surface. The second day goes better. The oxen are slightly less exhausted, the soil slightly less wet, the man's hands fully warmed. 2 strips are completed. The ploughing total is now 3.5 strips of the 4 that constitute the household's full allocation. The remaining half strip will be done in the second ploughing window, which comes 2 weeks later, and the late planting will cost some measure of yield from that final section. This is the accumulated cost of 1 sick infant, and 1 missed Labor Day, and 1 court fine in a bad harvest year, delivered through the causally continuous medium of an exhausted plough team working marginal soil in late winter. By the last days of March, the house shows what it shows at winter's end every year, which is the evidence of having been lived in continuously under significant pressure. The wall patches are still fresh and pale against the older, darker surrounding daub. The sleeping rushes were replaced, but the area near the fire is already developing a darkened margin where foot traffic concentrates. The soot line on the underside of the thatch has not changed because the fire has been burning through the same amount of wood for the same number of hours, regardless of the season. The loft boards have a gray sheen from accumulated smoke exposure. The notched stairway timber needs its 5th notch repaired, and the man has added this to the current task list. The grain barrel is at its lowest. There are perhaps 35 pounds remaining. The spring's first usable forage, nettles and dock leaves and early chickweed, will begin to supplement the household's diet within weeks, reducing the consumption rate from the barrel. And the seed grain is untouched. The animals have survived. The 2 pigs, the chickens reduced by 1, the cat. The oxen survived in the communal enclosure. The infant is well. The fever is months past. The residual cough is diminishing toward silence. The infant has reached the spring smaller than it might have been in a different winter, carrying in its body the record of December's smoke and January's cold and February's fever in a form that will not be visible to any observer, but that is present nonetheless in the specific weight and composition of a 7-month-old who arrived at spring through the same passage as everyone else in the building. The woman opens the shutter on the first morning that feels genuinely different from winter. The cold is still present, but the quality of the light through the opening is different, fuller, and the sun higher and the angle more direct, so that it enters the room and falls on the far wall in a rectangle that tracks across the floor through the morning hours as the sun moves. The light has been absent from inside this room for months. It returns without announcement, without significance, as a physical fact like any other physical fact in the room. She stands at the open shutter for a moment before returning to the fire. The morning sequence begins as it does every morning. The fire is tended, the grain is measured, the bread is started, the infant is nursed, the children descend from the loft. The oldest is dispatched for water. The day begins to unfold in its particular direction, today's direction, the direction of spring's beginning. The house stands where it stood in October and where it will stand in October again. Its timber frame embedded in the ground at the same posts, its roof repaired but recognizable, its single room containing the same furniture, the same tools, the same population, give or take 1 elderly woman who died in November and is replaced in the household's arithmetic by nothing except the absence of her labor and her need. The floor is earth. The walls are wattle and daub. The roof is thatch. The fire is in the middle of the room. None of these details are aesthetic. None of them are quaint. None of them are the product of a simpler or more natural or more authentic way of living. They are the product of a specific set of economic and legal constraints that determine what materials can be used, what labor is available, and what standard of housing is sufficient to maintain a labor supply without enabling independence. The house is built to the minimum required to keep its occupants alive and functional because anything above the minimum would represent accumulated capital that the system is designed to prevent from accumulating. The roof patches hold through the first spring rains. The field is planted in the sequence the rotation specifies. The planting is done by the man and the oldest child together. The child walking behind the plowed strips with a small bag of seed grain and dropping it into the shallow furrows at the intervals that a season of observed planting has taught both of them. The seed grain, held intact through the entire winter, passes from the bag into the soil. The soil closes over it. The world continues. The manorial court's records show one entry, crossed out, for a household that missed a labor obligation in the winter and paid the fine in March. The record does not show the infant's fever or the woman's cracked hands or the grain measured in decreasing quantities or the thatch repaired in wind. It shows an obligation and its fulfillment, which is all the system requires of the record. The household's internal record is different. It is carried in the body and in the specific calibration of every future decision. The slight increase in the threshold before a labor obligation is risked. The slightly more aggressive maintenance of the woodpile before next winter. The slightly earlier assessment of the seed-grain separation. None of these adjustments are revolutionary. None of them represent a departure from the household's position in the system. They are the micro-scale learning of a family that has passed through one winter's compression and emerged slightly more precisely aware of the shape of the margin they live within. The margin has not changed. The awareness of it is sharper. Spring grows across the field in the way that spring always grows, indifferent to the specific difficulty of the winter that preceded it, generating green from soil that held suffering and seed with equal facility, offering the household the same temporary reprieve it offers every year before the following autumn brings harvest and extraction and the first cold in the beginning of the next winter. The building will stand through summer. The animals will move outside, and the interior will lighten and air out, and the smoke line on the thatch will be the only winter record visible to someone entering the room in July. The family will work the field from dawn until dark in the long days, the man and the oldest child, and the woman when she can, building the harvest that will determine what January contains. The infant will crawl by summer. By the following winter it will walk, and it will have been weaned, and it will eat what the household eats at the rate the household allows. It will sleep in the loft with the others and breathe the smoke and cough through December, the way everyone in this structure has always coughed through December, and it will carry forward into its particular life the specific inheritance of the household it was born into. The earthen floor. On the thatched roof, the manorial obligation, the grain barrel's January anxiety, the fire that must be maintained from dawn, because if it goes out, so might you. This is the house. It belongs to no one, and everyone survives inside it until they do not. The system that produced it and that requires it continues past every occupant, recording obligations and their fulfillment, noting absences, imposing fines, expecting labor, and waiting with complete indifference for the next family to believe. Briefly, in the warmth of the hearth as something given rather than extracted. The hearth burns, the thatch holds, the barrel diminishes. The season turns,